The silence that would fall over that gym did not yet exist, but it had already been promised. In a few seconds, a public certainty would be torn from its place, and no one there would leave with the same conviction they had entered with. There was no announcement, no stopwatch, no formal warning, only the invisible tension of something about to break. The space breathed expectation, as if the air itself had grown denser. 6 seconds did not seem like enough time to decide anything, much less to dismantle an entire hierarchy. And yet, that was exactly what was about to happen. What would be seen would not stretch on, would not repeat itself, would not ask for confirmation. When it ended, there would be no applause, no explanations, no requests for a rematch. Only a silent understanding that something fundamental had been revealed there, briefly, precisely, and impossible to unsee. Late afternoon light filtered through the dojo's tall windows, casting slanted bands of illumination across the worn tatami. The gym looked far too ordinary to carry the weight of what was approaching. Motionless training bags, mirrors marked by time, the smell of old sweat mixed with wood. Students gathered their belongings, instructors spoke in low voices, visitors watched with contained curiosity. Everything suggested routine. But routine had been displaced the moment a certainty was spoken aloud. The sentence still echoed in the space. Even without being repeated, it was not a formal challenge, but an absolute statement. There, in that symbolic space of martial authority, one technique had been declared useless before another. The dojo, meant to teach control, had become the inevitable stage for a public correction. Bruce Lee was there as he always was, discreet, attentive, never occupying the center. His light frame did not draw immediate attention, and his posture did not announce confrontation. There was no urgency in him to prove anything. Still, the provocation struck him not only as an individual, but as a guardian of a principle. The statement cast into the air did not ask for a verbal response, it demanded consequence. Around him, eyes began to fix, waiting for a reaction, waiting for a choice. Time seemed suspended between silent acceptance and the need to act. It was not a matter of victory or defeat, but of allowing, or not allowing, a false belief to solidify in front of everyone. The decisive moment had not yet begun, but the promise was already made. Something there would be interrupted forever. The dojo occupied an unassuming building among busy streets in Hong Kong, removed from the city's direct noise, but never fully isolated from it. The distant sound of traffic blended with the soft echo of footsteps on the mat. The walls bore marks of years of training, small cracks, sweat stains, signs of constant use. Long mirrors reflected moving bodies, and, that late afternoon, also reflected attentive faces trying to decipher what would come next. The space was neither ceremonial nor luxurious. It was functional, real, lived in, a place where authority came not from displayed titles, but from how someone moved, breathed, and occupied space. Precisely for that reason, any challenge issued there carried maximum weight. Nothing in that environment allowed for prolonged performance or empty speech. Everything had to be sustained by the body. It was a period of transition. Traditional martial arts coexisted with the growing influence of Western combat styles, brought by athletes, soldiers, and sports entertainment. Comparisons were inevitable, and hasty judgments became common. To many, Eastern techniques were seen as beautiful but fragile, disciplined, yet impractical against direct force. The dojo functioned as a meeting point for these clashing views. Young people searching for identity trained there, instructors protective of tradition, and visitors curious to test limits. The social hierarchy of the space was clear but unstable. Respect had to be reaffirmed constantly, not through words, but through coherence between speech and action. Any failure was observed, commented on, remembered. That was why, when a technique was publicly questioned, the effect spread quickly. Not responding meant accepting the imposed narrative. Bruce Lee understood that fragile balance better than he appeared to. He knew the environment not only as a practitioner, but as a careful observer of human behavior. He knew that, in that space, silence could be interpreted as agreement. His presence there was not performative. He moved among the students, corrected stances, adjusted minimal details, always with economy of gesture. He did not seek centrality. Still, his authority existed, sustained by consistency and technical clarity. The conflict approaching was not born of personal rivalry, but of a conceptual fracture exposed before everyone. Allowing it to solidify would compromise not only his position, but the integrity of what he taught. The environment now observed not his muscles, but his decision. Expectation began to turn into pressure. The visitor who had caused the rupture remained confident. His body occupied space with ease. Broad shoulders, solid base, the posture of someone accustomed to dominating other bodies. The titles he carried did not need to be announced. They were implicit in his confidence. To him, the dojo was just another place where his logic worked. The atmosphere supported that reading. The physical contrast was evident, almost didactic. Weight versus lightness. Impact versus fluidity. Some students exchanged silent glances. Others discreetly moved closer, forming a spontaneous semicircle. There was no sign of retreat from the visitor, no request for mediation. Reality was anchored. Space, time, and conditions were defined. Everything suggested that the next choice would not be optional. It would simply be inevitable. The difference between the two bodies became impossible to ignore as collective attention sharpened. The wrestler seemed larger with each step, not because he grew, but because he occupied space with absolute conviction. His feet marked the mat like fixed points, difficult to dislodge. His torso leaned slightly forward, prepared for direct contact. There was in him the confidence of someone who trusted mass, traction, and impact as universal solutions. Around them, some observers were already forming silent conclusions. The physical contrast simplified the conflict before it even began. For many, the outcome seemed logical. The logic of weight, once accepted, dispenses with long demonstrations. The promise of a fall is enough. This initial imbalance did not favor the protagonist, but it created the kind of pressure that does not allow explanations, only concrete response. Bruce Lee remained still enough to seem even smaller. His low center of gravity drew little attention, but his eyes tracked every micro-adjustment of the opponent. He did not fix his gaze on the face, but on the line of the shoulders, the rotation of the hips, the intention that precedes movement. His body was not preparing to resist, but to read. Apparent passivity was, in fact, absolute restraint. He knew any premature gesture would be interpreted as anxiety or challenge. He offered neither. The silence around him began to work against him. Each second without reaction amplified the other's confidence and fed the expectations of those present. The inequality was not only physical, it was symbolic. One side represented immediate certainty, the other, a promise still invisible. The wrestler took another step forward, reducing the distance without ceremony. There was no explicit threat, only the approach that precedes control. His relaxed arms concealed readiness to grab, wrap, and throw. It was a movement rehearsed thousands of times, applied to countless bodies, always with the same result. He trusted repetition. For him, there was no scenario where it failed. Some students held their breath. Others adjusted their stance, as if trying to see the inevitable more clearly. The space began to close around the two, forming a silent circle. No one intervened. No one mediated. Pressure came from the collective gaze, from the expectation that something would finally prove which logic prevailed there. Tension grew not from contact, but from its imminence. Bruce Lee felt the moment approaching with absolute clarity, not as anxiety, but alignment. He knew there would be no margin for error, no opportunity for later correction. The first movement would define everything. It could not be force against force, nor displayed speed. It would need to be precision at the exact instant when the other's intention became commitment. His internal dilemma was not fear, but responsibility. Intervening meant assuming the weight of public demonstration. Not intervening meant allowing a false idea to crystallize before everyone. He adjusted the position of his feet almost imperceptibly, a gesture so discreet it went unnoticed by most. His body appeared relaxed, but it was ready. The inequality was still visible, but now it carried a hidden error, and errors, when ignored, demand a high price. The circle around them closed without command. People adjusted their positions instinctively, seeking a better angle, as if something essential might be lost if they blinked. The available space shrank, turning the center of the dojo into a point of silent compression. Time seemed to slow, not by dramatic effect, but by collective concentration. Every external noise disappeared. All that remained was the faint friction of feet on the mat and the restrained breathing of those present. The wrestler interpreted the silence as confirmation. His body responded with even greater confidence, preparing for the action he considered inevitable. For him, the moment before confrontation required no fine calculation. It was enough to advance. For Bruce Lee, that same instant was everything. It was where reading, choice, and consequence aligned or failed at once. The antagonist slightly bent his knees, adjusting his base for entry. There was no hurry. There was certainty. He knew exactly how to take down someone of that size. He had done it countless times. The movement would start with the torso, followed by contact at the hips, culminating in a weight transfer that would resolve everything. It was simple, efficient, direct. His mistake lay precisely in that simplicity. Bruce Lee was not observing the attack as a whole, but the point where it would cease to be intention and become physical commitment. His muscles remained loose, ready to respond without rigidity. There was no visible tension in his shoulders or hands. This confused some observers, who expected a classic defensive posture. But he was not defending against something that did not yet exist. He was waiting for the exact instant when the other could no longer retreat. The silence now had physical weight. No one moved. The expectation was not of a long fight, but of immediate impact. Some students felt a strange discomfort, as if they were about to witness something irreversible. The wrestler made the final distance adjustment, moving close enough to touch. His eyes did not seek reaction. They had already decided. Bruce Lee perceived the minimal change in the opponent's breathing, the involuntary signal that the attack was about to begin. There was no racing heart, no emotional impulse, only clarity. He knew that from that point on, there would be no room for correction or explanation. The confrontation was defined before it even began. Everything depended on a few centimeters, on a precise shift, on a reading made at the right time. The threshold had been crossed. When the movement finally began, it was not explosive. It was committed. The wrestler advanced with his entire body, transferring mass and intention toward the takedown. It was the moment he trusted. For Bruce Lee, it was the only possible moment. There was no retreat, no frontal resistance. He entered the movement, not against it. A minimal angle adjustment, exact contact at the point of imbalance, an almost imperceptible guidance of the other's force. Everything happened too fast for observers to analyze in real time. It was not yet the decisive action, but the path was sealed. The antagonist's error could no longer be corrected. His body had been surrendered to its own logic. The next second would allow no return. And everyone, even without understanding how, felt that something was about to resolve definitively. The first contact produced no audible impact. There was no sharp collision, no visible exertion. To those watching, it seemed as if the movement had lost force in midair. The wrestler's body continued forward, but it was no longer in control of its own trajectory. The center of mass had been displaced before force could organize itself. Bruce Lee did not push, pull, or resist. He redirected. His feet adjusted with millimetric precision, following the line of attack as if already familiar with it. In less than a second, the antagonist's base ceased to exist. The weight that had seemed an advantage became a useless burden. Balance was broken without apparent violence. To many, it still looked like nothing had happened. That was the illusion. The physical decision had already been made. The result merely awaited the minimal time required to manifest. The following second condensed everything the eye had missed in the first. The wrestler's body began to descend, not due to evident external force, but from absolute lack of support. His arms tried to adjust, but found only emptiness where resistance was expected. The floor approached too quickly. The impact occurred cleanly, without exaggeration, resolving the confrontation with incontestable clarity. There was no dramatic roll, no immediate attempt at recovery. Only the dull sound of the body meeting the mat, and then complete silence. Bruce Lee had already stepped back half a step when the opponent touched the ground. He did not follow the fall, did not seek additional control. The movement had ended exactly where it needed to end. Everything had occurred within such a short interval that some were still blinking, trying to mentally reconstruct the sequence. The third second brought not continuation, but gradual understanding. The wrestler remained on the ground a moment longer than expected, not from extreme pain, but from absolute surprise. His body was slow to accept what had occurred. The logic that had always worked had failed without warning. Bruce Lee remained standing, motionless, without a posture of victory. His gaze did not seek external confirmation. He knew any additional gesture would turn demonstration into exhibition. The circle around them remained closed, now from shock. No one spoke, no one moved. Some observers felt a discomfort difficult to name, as if they had witnessed something that dismantled more than a technique. Time seemed to have resumed its normal rhythm, but space had not yet reorganized. Reality had been corrected in seconds and had not yet found words. The fourth second sealed the irreversibility of the moment. The wrestler tried to rise partially, but interrupted the movement upon noticing the surrounding gazes. There was no hostility in them, only surprise and recalibration. He understood, still on the ground, that it had not been chance. Bruce Lee took another step back, opening space, offering silence instead of triumph. The decision to stop there transformed the physical event into a complete lesson. There was nothing left to prove beyond what had already been shown. The confrontation ended without prolongation, without punishment, without humiliation. 6 seconds had been enough. The dojo remained the same, but the invisible hierarchy sustaining it had been rearranged. The dominant logic collapsed not through superior force, but through incontestable precision. And that, more than the fall itself, was what echoed. The silence that followed was not awkward, but dense. No one reacted because no one knew exactly how to react. The wrestler finally stood up, moving with restraint, without hurry, like someone reorganizing not only his body, but his understanding of what had just happened. There was no visible anger on his face, nor explicit shame. There was something more unsettling: recalibration. He avoided direct eye contact for a moment, not out of submission, but processing. The space around them seemed suspended between before and after. Bruce Lee remained apart, arms relaxed at his sides, breathing steady. There was no sign of exaltation in him. The absence of celebration amplified the impact of what had occurred. That silent choice prevented the episode from being reduced to spectacle. What remained was only the raw fact, impossible to reinterpret as luck or exaggeration. Some students exchanged quick glances, as if seeking mutual confirmation that they had witnessed the same thing. More experienced instructors maintained serious expressions, but their eyes revealed technical recognition. There was no applause, no immediate murmuring. The collective reaction was restrained because the event offered no easy emotional script. It had not been violent enough to shock, nor theatrical enough to excite. The victory had not been displayed, only acknowledged. This shifted the focus from strength to understanding. The wrestler remained silent, adjusting his clothing, regaining posture. Instead of trying to justify or challenge again, he accepted the space offered. Bruce Lee's decision not to advance transformed that moment into something larger than an individual defeat. The environment began to understand that it was not about competition. Bruce Lee broke the silence only with movement. He turned slightly toward the nearest students, resuming the position he had occupied before the interruption. There was no speech, no detailed technical explanation. His choice not to verbalize the lesson reinforced its character. What needed to be understood had already been shown. By not positioning himself as a victor, he removed from the antagonist the need for public defense. This preserved the dignity of both and consolidated the meaning of the gesture. The dojo gradually resumed its flow, but not its normality. Something had been incorporated into collective memory. The confrontation ceased to be about kung fu versus wrestling. It became about reading, timing, and control. The world's reaction there did not come in words, but in prolonged silence. And in that silence, the hierarchy reorganized itself without announcement. In the days that followed, the episode began to circulate quietly, transmitted in fragments among practitioners and instructors. There was no formal record, no inflated narrative. Precisely for that reason, the account gained strength. Each retelling preserved the same core. A few seconds, no excess, an error exploited with absolute precision. Those who heard it did not ask about secret techniques or unusual strength, but about the exact moment when everything resolved. Validation came not from delayed applause, but from subtle shifts in posture. Instructors who had once questioned began to observe with different attention. Invitations arose, not for exhibition, but for technical exchange. The event was not treated as an isolated feat, but as evidence of a functional principle. The story fixed itself because it resisted exaggeration. The less it was adorned, the more incontestable it became. Technical truth endured over time. For Bruce Lee, the impact did not manifest as immediate assent or public celebration. His routine remained almost identical: training, corrections, silence. Still, the environment around him had changed. The questions that arose were more careful, less challenging. Doubt gave way to legitimate curiosity. He did not begin to occupy the center, but the center adjusted to his presence. The legacy of the episode was not in the fall, but in how it was conducted. Winning without humiliating redefined the meaning of authority in that space. The implicit lesson was clear: effectiveness does not require aggressiveness, and true control dispenses with ostentation. The episode continued to echo, not as myth, but as silent reference. a point of inflection that taught without needing repetition. The dojo continued to exist as before, but now carried an embodied memory. Whenever strength and size were mentioned as absolute guarantees, someone silently remembered that late afternoon. The question did not need to be asked aloud. It imposed itself. What truly decides a confrontation? The amount of force applied, or the quality of control exercised at the right instant? The story offered no verbal answer, only observable consequence. 6 seconds had been enough to dismantle a comfortable certainty, not through violence, but through clarity. The final echo required no agreement, only reflection. And perhaps that was the greatest effect of what had occurred. To show that power without control does not endure when confronted by precise understanding of body and time. The silence that remained was not empty. It was learning in its rawest form.